Fueled by a terrifying rage, Mendez and his team stormed Jamal's home, tearing through every inch as if trying to find justification for the brutal force they were about to unleash. When they found Jamal, it was a savage attack. In that house, with blood on the walls and Mendez's taunts filling the air, Jamal experienced firsthand what it means to be crushed not just physically, but mentally, by unchecked power. This was no ordinary arrest. It was a brutal show of dominance that no one would soon forget. Keep on listening till the end to find out what happened to Jamal and what the consequences are of this horrifying story. Imagine a federal agent so untouchable. He thought he could get away with brutalizing innocent people without a second glance. Carl Mendez wasn't just any cop, he was a ruthless force who terrorized minorities for years, beating men bloody and planting drugs to cover his tracks. His latest victim? Jamal Brooks, a young black man who barely survived the savage raid that left his home in ruins, his family brutalized, and his life shattered. Mendez wasn't your average agent. He had this way about him, a ruthlessness that he didn't bother hiding. But even the most feared men have their limits. You could feel it in the air, like a storm brewing, ready to break. And then came the night everything changed. It was supposed to be just another routine operation, the kind of thing Mendez could do in his sleep. The target was Jamal Brooks, a young black man from a small, racially diverse town that had seen more than its fair share of Mendez's brand of justice. Jamal was no criminal. He was just trying to get by, doing his best to stay out of trouble. But to Mendez, Jamal was exactly the kind of person he'd been itching to go after. A black man who, in Mendez's eyes, was guilty the moment he was born. The plan was simple: bust in, make the arrest, and move on. But from the moment Mendez set foot in that town, things started going wrong. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mendez didn't just want to arrest Jamal, he wanted to make an example out of him, to show everyone what happens when you cross Carl Mendez. He stormed into Jamal's home with a fury that was as unjustified as it was terrifying. The operation quickly turned into a nightmare. Mendez and his team smashed their way through Jamal's home, ripping apart everything in sight, as if they were searching for something that could justify the violence they were about to unleash. When they found Jamal, they didn't just arrest him, they brutalized him. They threw him to the ground, cuffing him so tightly that his wrists bled, then beat him until he was barely conscious. The sounds of fists meeting flesh echoed through the house, mingled with Jamal's cries for help. It was as if Mendez had unleashed all his pent-up rage on this one man, his actions fueled not by justice but by pure, unadulterated hate. The sight was gruesome. Blood splattered on the walls, the floor, and all over Jamal's body. It was the kind of violence that leaves deep scars, both physical and mental, that never fully heal. But Mendez wasn't satisfied with just breaking Jamal's body. He wanted to crush his spirit, too. He mocked Jamal as he lay there, barely conscious, throwing racial slurs at him as if to remind him of his place in Mendez's twisted world. Mendez's men stood by, doing nothing to stop him, as if they were under some kind of spell, too afraid or too complicit to intervene. It was a horrifying display of power, one that no one in that house would ever forget. And yet, even as Mendez reveled in his brutality, he was unaware that his time was running out. This wasn't just another raid gone wrong. This was the moment when everything would start to unravel. Someone had been watching, someone who had seen the entire operation go down, and they weren't about to let Mendez get away with it this time. The violence, the racial hatred, the abuse of power, it had all been captured, and the evidence was about to be unleashed. The night the raid went down was nothing short of a living nightmare, the kind of horror that scars you deep inside and never really leaves. Carl Mendez had gotten wind of some so-called intelligence. Nothing concrete, just a few whispers about Jamal Brooks being involved in something shady. But in Mendez's twisted mind, that was enough. He didn't need solid proof, just an excuse to do what he did best: unleash hell on whoever crossed his path. Jamal's home, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood, became the battleground for Mendez's personal vendetta. The way Mendez and his team stormed in, you'd think they were raiding a cartel's headquarters, not the home of a young black man who had done nothing more than exist. They didn't bother with the usual formalities. There was no knock on the door, no polite request to come inside. Instead, they barreled through the door, smashing it off its hinges with guns drawn and adrenaline pumping. The chaos that followed was pure brutality. Mendez was like a man possessed. his face twisted with a rage that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with his deep-seated hatred. Jamal barely had time to react before he was dragged from his bed, thrown to the floor, and beaten within an inch of his life. His screams echoed through the house, mixing with the shouts of the officers as they tore the place apart, looking for anything they could use to justify what they were doing. But Jamal wasn't the only victim that night. His mother, an elderly woman with a heart condition, was shoved to the ground when she tried to protect her son, her fragile body crumpling under the force. Blood pooled beneath her as she lay there, gasping for breath, but the officers didn't stop. They dragged Jamal's younger sister out of her room, yanking her by the hair as she cried out for help that wasn't coming. The violence was sickening. The kind of thing that leaves you feeling dirty just hearing about it. Mendez didn't care about the destruction he was causing. This was all just another day's work for him. As the night wore on, the brutality didn't let up. Mendez, realizing that the raid was yielding nothing but pain and suffering, decided to take matters into his own hands. He pulled a small baggie of drugs from his pocket, something he always kept on hand for situations like this, and slipped it into Jamal's belongings. It was a dirty move, but one Mendez had perfected over the years. To him, this was just how the game was played. He planted the evidence with a smirk, confident that it would be enough to cover his tracks, to make everything that happened that night seem justified. But what Mendez didn't know was that he wasn't as invisible as he thought. Someone was watching. Hidden in the shadows, a figure with a camera had been recording the entire raid. Every punch, every kick, every tear, captured in crystal-clear detail. This wasn't some random bystander who happened to be in the right place at the right time. No, this person had been waiting, knowing that Mendez would eventually slip up, that his arrogance would be his downfall. The identity of this mysterious witness remained hidden, but you could tell they weren't just in it for kicks. There was something deeply personal about the way they moved, the way they stayed just out of sight but close enough to catch everything. Maybe they had their own score to settle with Mendez, or maybe they were just tired of seeing innocent lives destroyed by his hand. Whatever the reason, this shadowy figure had just become the most dangerous person in Mendez's life, even if he didn't know it yet. The footage was damning. When it finally made its way online, it sparked a firestorm that no one could have predicted. The video, raw and unedited, spread like wildfire across social media, igniting a wave of outrage that swept through the nation. People were horrified by what they saw. Innocent people being brutalized in their own home, a federal agent planting evidence to cover up his crimes. It was the kind of footage that made your blood boil, that made you question everything you thought you knew about justice. The reaction was immediate and intense. Civil rights groups were up in arms, demanding an investigation. The agency tried to do damage control, but it was too late. The public had seen the truth, and they weren't about to let this go. Local law enforcement was thrown into chaos, forced to confront the reality that one of their own had gone rogue in the worst possible way. And Mendez, for the first time in his career, found himself on the defensive. He tried to deny it, of course, claimed the footage was doctored, that it was all part of some conspiracy against him, but no one was buying it. The evidence was too clear, too visceral. The more he squirmed, the more guilty he looked. And as the media dug deeper, more skeletons started tumbling out of Mendez's closet. The man who had once been untouchable was suddenly very much in reach, and the world was closing in on him. So, what are your thoughts on this story? Let us know in the comments below.